Welcome to lecture number 4, the second last lecture we'll have here in Goslar for this year, if I'm not mistaken. So next week, one more lecture, and maybe something like a seminar style, where it would be helpful if as many people as possible can make it here. I know that some of you are living somewhere else, but for those of you who might have like a closer relationship to Goslar, if you could make it here, that hopefully could help. I hope that I have some time to like prepare a little bit of a workshop seminar style thing on top of the actual lecture content that we'll do instead of a Q&A session, but I'm not 100% sure. There's so much other stuff going on. But before we do that, we first going to cover lecture number 4. Then you will have your first exercise based on MOOC content that we have prepared. Actually, you can already find this lecture today also as a MOOC content. We were not quite sure if we could make it in time, but it's ready. Teresa did an awesome job. It's already online, so you can all leave now. But we're still going to do a live lecture. I hope that it's more or less the same content-wise and the way how I present it, but otherwise it's supposed to be very, very similar. Good. There is one minor thing that is really new or is not part of the MOOC video that we prepared and the content, and that pertains to news updates and org stuff. I know we already told you like a few times before, yes, there will be some MOOC content, but just to like really specifically tell you what we expect and what to do. So I hope that by now you have found your way to the course website, ltg.etce-lab.de, or by just clicking on that link there. It's also on GitHub. It's on our research group website. It should be on StudAPI. So there are various ways to find the website. So I hope you made it there. There are different lectures on that, or like not lectures, different modules on that website that correspond to different lectures. You can click on them, then you find the video, then you find text, then you find exercises, then you find multiple choice questions and other additional content to use. And for today's exercise that we'll talk about in detail later, you will have to watch your first videos that were pre-produced on that website and embedded in some kind of a like learning progress test for you. Very simple, so don't worry. It's a test. You're our guinea pigs, but you have to use the website for the first time now. Some of you might have done that before, but now is like the really first official interaction point. Next week, gonna be live, and then 11th of December is the first pre-produced complete lecture and MOOC video, because Anand will be somewhere else on this planet. Therefore, he could not do the life cycle assessment lecture that he is in charge of, like it's a certain tradition here. And then 18th of December will be another pre-produced video. Then we have Christmas, New Year's Eve, and then we meet again at some point in January. For each of those lectures, we still will have live Q&A exercises. You can do it here. If someone would like to show up just for the Q&A exercise, feel free to do so. If everyone explicitly tells me, no, we don't want to come to Goslar just for the Q&A, then we can do it completely online. I don't mind, but I would be here. I'm available. So just let us know up front. So watch the video whenever you like. Q&A session, normal time slot, or the official time slot that is listed on StudAPI, because so far we always did it like, yeah, we're done with the lecture, 5-minute break, and then we do the Q&A. But now it's like really using the official time slots. So go to website, watch the videos, do the exercises, have fun. Q&A, normal time slot. 3 p.m. according to Teresa. I wasn't quite sure. And yeah, questions? Very good, because I probably explained it very well. If there are any questions from the audience, just type it in the chat, and then Teresa may be able to answer on the fly, or we can also push it to the Q&A session later today. So everything from now on is part of the MOOC video online. Oh, sorry, not your carbon footprint homework, because we could also not produce it. So last week we had the carbon footprint homework. We talked also a lot about the carbon footprint parts, and we asked you to figure out, okay, what is your carbon footprint? And we got quite diverse feedback. So if I'm not mistaken, we have quite large variation here, from 7 tons per year per person at the lowest end to 35 tons on the other end. What we're supposed to have in average in order to get somehow close to 1.5 or 2 degrees is something like 3 to 3.5 tons, depending on how you calculate that, on a global average. So 7 tons, even though super low in this comparison, twice as much as you would have as a budget if we take the global CO2 budget that we have and divide them on a fair way between all the people on this planet. So you're still using twice as much as you're supposed to be. 35 thereby being factor 10 off by what we would have. We did not ask for your names and your carbon footprint because we don't want to make this a blame someone session, because there might be very good reasons to have a higher footprint than others might have. So I'm from Germany, I'm living in Germany. If I want to see my family that's not living near, define nearby, not compared to Anand's family. but I don't have to take an airplane to see them. Like, I can drive there by car. If I'm very motivated, I can drive there by bike. But it's like near distance. So that is probably where a lot of carbon footprint comes from for most people, is travel-related activities. Because no matter how much meat you eat every day, if you have a complete 100% meat diet, you're not getting to 35 tons. If you heat your house to 30 degrees, and assuming that it's not a 500 square meter house, you're not getting to 35 tons. So I'm highly suspecting that 35 tons is mostly due to travel-related arrangements. Because just a flight, I don't know, to New York or Hawaii or like anything that goes across continents usually burns quite a lot of, or emits quite a lot of fossil fuels. Most people in Germany are ranging somewhere in this 7 to 12 or 7 to 13 range, because some of them travel like once a year within Europe or once every few years cross-continental. That then pushes the budget a little bit, but most people in Germany have this like 7 or 8 to 12, 13. Did anyone try to game the system and get to the lowest possible value? So essentially acting like you are a saint with respect to carbon emission, just like give the lowest possible answer with respect to emissions ever. Someone from the audience? So not from the live audience, from the online audience, obviously. Doesn't seem to be the case, at least there is no ping. Because this is, as a computer scientist, obviously something that I'm very interested in doing so. And a lot of carbon footprint calculators fall for the trap of then giving you a 0 tons of CO2 emissions or something very low. And you can usually find the more accurate and better ones by having a different result. Because there's a lot of implicit carbon emissions that even if you just sit under the table here and don't do anything for the whole year, and we cut off electricity, heating, or whatever, you still have a quite high carbon footprint. I'm not quite sure 100% anymore like where this number is, but I think like something like 2 or 3 tons, because we provide a lot of infrastructure for you through the German state. University, highways, healthcare, army, other ways of maintaining our society. This is a carbon footprint that you cause as citizens of this this country, or as people living here. You don't have to be a citizen, but living here, that you struggle probably to influence. Like, how could you personally lower the carbon emissions of the university or the hospital? Sure, you could try to not get sick, therefore not causing any resources being used there. Or you could argue in favor of turning down the heating here while we have a lecture. That would reduce the emissions a little bit, but most of those emissions are out of your hand. So there is a little bit of room that you cannot influence at all. and then the rest is more or less in your hands. But even though some of you probably have noticed it when you talked about heating in this carbon footprint calculator, that you as students probably also can't really do much. You can either decide to heat or not to heat, but you cannot install a more efficient heating system or put more insulation on the house or decide to switch to a more sustainable heating approach. By the way, one of our Hiwis is working on a nice tool to better visualize this difference between what it makes to use maybe firewood for heating certain type of apartment, or should you use gas, or should you use coal, should you use penguins, should you use electricity, like what's the footprint of this, or the impact of using different methods of heating in the context of a certain apartment, and so on and so on. So once it's ready, I will bring it to the lecture, and then you can also have a look at it and test it and see if it makes sense or not, because it's an experiment. But that said, 7, quite nice. 35, quite high, but I don't want to judge why this might be high, because I only have those numbers, and I also want to emphasize that this is not supposed to be a blaming game. This is supposed to give you an idea where you are standing with respect to carbon emissions and what we could afford theoretically. So, or also practically, and this is more or less the 3.5 tons now, and by 2050 we should be all to net zero. So 0 emissions from what you're doing per year, per person on a global scale. Quite a distance to go. Good. Now we are approaching the pre-recorded context. So last lectures we talked about first the challenges, and then moved also to the definitions of sustainability. Then we talked about climate change, resources, environmental pollution, and so on and so on. So you have now a little bit of an intuition of the problems, parts of the solution. You also know what sustainability is. If someone would like to maybe repeat the definitions of sustainability. Come on. There was something about future generations in there. Anand.
Satisfy the needs of the present generations while not compromising the needs of the future.
Thank you very much. This is why he is my PhD student. Satisfying your own needs that you have right now without compromising the needs of future generations. That's one of the very well known or very well popularly used definitions of sustainability. There are many other. We talked about that. It's a quite vague and broad definition, and therefore people tried to categorize it a little bit more, or also cut it into pieces to make it better. Okay, what should I do to get there? And one of those approaches, among many, are the so-called Sustainable Development Goals that have been proposed by the United Nations. This is not supposed to be a talk about the United Nations, but just to give you an idea, because we'll get back to this to the United Nations later, again and again. So they are essentially the largest intergovernmental organization in the world, and more or less every country on this planet, depending on how you count, is a part of the United Nations, except for maybe North Korea and some other countries or places. And they are essentially supposed to maintain international peace and make sure that everyone cooperates among each other. A little bit of lessons learned after the Second World War, where this stuff didn't really work out as intended. And this is organized in 6 principal bodies and some autonomous specialized agencies. You probably have heard of the Security Council. Very busy since Russia invaded Ukraine. You have also the General Assembly. You have the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the Food and Agriculture Organization. So some of those 3-4 letter agencies that are not located in the US, but on some more international level, you've probably heard of them. Why am I telling you this? Because they came up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And they will also be an important part of the later aspects of this lecture. So the Sustainable Development Goals, or in short, SDGs, are 17 interlinked goals. So each goal depends on the other. They have been proposed in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly. So It's one of the six principal bodies. And they are supposed to be achieved by 2030 by all UN member states, so 193 states. We have 2023 now, soon 2024. 6 years to go. I'm not gonna tell you how far we are right now. We'll get back to that later. But you have probably an intuition by now. Each of those goals has typically 8 to 12 targets. So we have 17 goals, each goal 8 to 12 targets. And then each of those targets has 1 to 4 indicators that are used to measure the progress towards reaching the targets and thereby also to goals. So 17 goals, 8 to 12 targets per goal, and then 1 to 4 indicators to measure how far did I get. And it's supposed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all people in the world by 2030. So the goal is not bad, or the intention behind that. Nothing to criticize here. I mostly criticize the progress that they made. What are the Sustainable Development Goals? You will now notice that some of them are quite vague and broad, and that some of them also maybe are conflicting with each other. So first goal, no poverty. Second goal, closely related, zero hunger. Good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure as number 9, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action as number 13, life below water, life on land, covering everything, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and number 17, a little bit of a feel-good goal, partnership for the goals. What kind of problems can you already see with those goals? Or do you not see any problems at all? Is this perfect as it is right now, or any potential hints where stuff could go wrong? Very vague, unspecific, yeah, okay. Some input from online. It doesn't mean that the three of you are off the hook. Laura is always asking the difficult question, why is gender equality separated from inequalities in general? That is a very good question, one that I cannot completely answer because I'm not an expert on neither of those. But maybe Teresa could jump in there because she has a sociology and political background. But I share your, not confusion, but like this, that some of those things seem, first of all, like super vague, but also what we just got from the online audience, that there is a weird distinction between two. For example, no poverty for me personally also implies that there is no hunger. If I'm hungry, there is poverty, and then I'm poor because I cannot afford food. So no poverty and hunger would, like, for me, be like falling in similar situation as gender equality and reduced inequalities. There are also some parts that have like a clear conflict or seem to have like at least a challenging relationship, like economic growth. We talked about the problem of using resources in a finite system of resources, and then also having to take care of climate action or saving life below and life on land. So there is at least, I don't want to say they are mutually exclusive, but at least there is a conflict. Yep, so there's also another goal conflict, zero hunger and life below water having a difficult relationship because we heavily rely on food that comes from below water, but obviously also life on land. I mean, we're also very much shitty people when it comes to preserving life on land, given how many people are like threatened with extinction, and also the fact that we have like a huge dumpster outside that we call the Harz, where everything is more or less polluted. So we're not really good at any of those goals. Good. So like just from looking at it the first time, like you can see there is a little, like it's vague. There are some goal conflicts. It's not quite clear how they came up with all of them. That's in general a problem when you are getting something from the United Nations, because you have to get a lot of people to agree on something that they don't really want to agree on, or where they just have so many different perspectives. So the SDGs are supposed to cover all 3 dimensions of sustainability. I did not put that in our slides before when we talked about sustainability, but there is a representation of sustainability that it's essentially that there's like economic sustainability, ecological sustainability, social sustainability, so that all of those are like part of sustainability, and that we have to make sure that all of these 3 dimensions, or sometimes they're represented as columns, that we have to get all of those 3 right. And then we have sustainability. If one of them is off, then it's not sustainability. I don't like that representation very much because it reduces it too much to those 3 categories. That's why usually I use this like slightly broader one. But they use it as inspiration. Many of the goals that we saw there focused very much on society. And there's no prioritization between different goals, because as they stated, the means of implementation targets under each sustainable development goal and goal 17, which are referred to above, are key to realizing our agenda and are of equal importance with the other goals and targets. We shall accord them equal priority in our implementation efforts and in the global indicator framework for monitoring our progress. And this is, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems, because I'm rather not poor and not hungry than I care about peace, justice, and strong institutions. I don't want to say we should all be at war, but first I would like to have something to eat and a shelter and maybe not freezing to death tonight. Partnerships for the goals is all nice, but still I remain here. And then clean water and sanitation. If I don't have anything, like if I don't have clean water to drink, I don't need a quality education because I will be dead in 3 days. So from a practical perspective, the no prioritization approach is challenging. On paper, of course, obviously it makes sense. Like we want to like everything be equal and so on. So I don't mind the intention. Just from a practical implementation, when times runs out or when you are in crisis, what do you do first? You don't care about quality education, probably. Okay, that's too long to read it out loud on paper. We'll follow up with that discussion later. Sorry about that. So that's like a problem. So challenges like water, food, and energy are vital prerequisites. If we don't have those, we can just close our shop. For human life, other goals cannot be achieved without them. So if we don't achieve those, we don't care about the rest, but the original intention says otherwise. Another problem is that each goal by itself does not guarantee sustainability according to the Sustainability Development Goals definitions. So you have to achieve all 17 of them, otherwise there is no sustainability according to those. And achieving all goals is quite challenging, especially if you think about the normal like government and normal like country. They have limited budget, they have limited time, they have limited efforts, they have other problems, they have also different political interests. So usually they're like in best case, they pick some of those goals. But I suspect that there is not a single country, government on this planet who wholeheartedly is trying to fulfill all 17 goals at once, because you're just like, oh shit, this is too much. How would you approach it? You would probably focus also on something intuitively. And you also have this problem of potential trade-off that we already covered a little bit earlier, or incompatibilities, or at least conflicts between different goals. So zero hunger versus environmental stability. Someone in the chat already wrote life below water being challenging in context of environment of zero hunger. Life on land similarly. Life on land often also conflicts with other parts. Economic growth versus decent work, because a lot of times growth is founded in economic exploitation of others, that then often doesn't really end up in decent work, but rather work. And there's a potential risk for or of greenwashing, that you take one of those goals that you somehow can fulfill with a product or startup idea or whatever you had. Earlier we had the pitches here at the digital technology study program for the first semesters, where we also had like ideas about sustainability. And you could easily pick one of those sustainability goals, put them on your first slide and say, look, because we fulfill this one sustainability development goal, we are now a sustainable startup. Please give us money. Thank you very much. This is my pitch. That probably gives you 100K. You probably won't get 1 million, but 100K for just having a sustainability development goal is not unrealistic. Of course, I'm joking, but you get the idea. Good. So, long story short, SDGs exist. So, take the last one into account before we move on to the SDGs, but I have to get back to the later part from Teresa, which is very long. But so what's the takeaway here? They exist, but they are very important in the political discourse. And today we're going to talk about political inaction or action a little bit more. And this is why I bring them up here. That when you talk to politicians about sustainability, it very often goes straight to sustainability development goals. Also in the corporate world, those sustainability development goals seem to be something like, or getting closer to something like a gold standard. Whenever they are claiming that they do something for sustainability, they get to these goals. And since they're doing something, they are fine. But as we just pointed out, without digging very deep and without spending much time here, this is not like, it's not a perfect solution. It's not bad to have those goals. It's not bad to work towards those goals. It would be amazing if only half of the 193 member states of the UN would get close to fulfilling them by 2030. But there's like a lot of buts here. Last input from the online audience. Can it not be challenging to achieve the ecological goals without the economic and social goals? War affects the natural resources and animal life too. Without propagation, it is difficult to make informed choices that are better for the environment. Absolutely. And this is why all of those goals are also interlinked. Depending on where you start, you might also be able to achieve more goals. But let's say you start from 0, then you probably prioritize food and clean water over quality education. However, if you're already a highly educated, if you already have a highly educated society, you might have tendencies to do less war, more war, and try to avoid war because you're not trying to fuck up your society and then have the potential risk of losing everything. You're also maybe aware of the resources that it costs to do a war, and that it pushes regions to further to to ecological collapse. Sure. So there's like a strong interconnection between those things. I mean, even if the Ukraine wins the war against Russia, large parts of that country will be ecological death zones. All the ammunition, all the stuff that exploded there, all the oil that went into the groundwater, all the leftovers from that war will make this a really shitty place to live from an ecological perspective. Even if they win, there's still a lot of loss that we will never get back, besides all the resources, money, time, and effort that we put into fighting this war over who can have which part of the country. So, of course, there's the connection. Do richer countries have, statistically speaking, less participations in war or just less wars on their own land? Once again, there are a lot of questions where I'm not an expert. Intuitively, we can maybe make this like a very nice discussion point for the Q&A session, because I think there are probably like very different opinions on that, or could be different inputs and opinion, especially from an interdisciplinary audience. I have a gut feeling towards the second part, or the second aspect, because one of the countries that has been very happy to fight one war after another, the United States, at least in this century, rarely fights on their own soil, but they are very busy fighting wars all over the planet. And they have been, I'm not sure if they're still the richest country in the world, but at least they have been the richest country in the world for the last, I don't know, few decades. I would assume that is true for most of the countries that like to play war. But as I said, I would leave that up for discussion for the Q&A session, and I'm not an expert. This was just a on-the-fly personal remark that I cannot vouch for, so please don't put it in the Bild-Zeitung. Good. Thank you very much for this very active participation. This is what I was missing for the last 2 years when we had to give this course in front of a camera because no one was coming to Goslar, or this course was also like very, very small and we were just getting started, so very small audience. So I like that much more than just talking. Good. Now, we talked about the SDGs to first of all give you another idea how you can view sustainability, but also to introduce you already to this idea of how political actions and politicians in particular is related to sustainability, how their approach towards sustainability can be perceived or how they address these problems. And since sustainability in general, but also climate change, environmental pollution, resource scarcity, those are like not really new issues. They have been around for a while. And since most of you answered in our survey that you are 40 or below or 35 and below, those problems have been there before we have even been born. So people must have thought about this before us. Like 2023, me giving this presentation, I cannot be the first person to tell you, look, we need to do something. And therefore, we would like to take the opportunity today to have a little bit of a short excursus into the history of things that have been done in respect to climate change. Obviously, not only climate change, but in the more like broader sense, also fighting environmental pollution and essentially this like how can we have a better, more sustainable world context, and how can we make sure that we're still alive in 100 years from now? Because things have happened, and it's not like nothing was done, but compared to the seriousness of the situation and the fact that we have known for this for quite a while, you can get the feeling that not enough has been done yet. And this is not going to be a complete list. This is by no means complete of all what happens, because otherwise I could give a whole lecture series on this, but I don't want to. The main takeaway is supposed to be, okay, get an idea, when did this start, where did this start, what were the different steps, so that you get a little bit of an idea, okay, what has already happened, because usually it's quite nice to learn from history, to not repeat the mistakes that may made 50 years ago. So we're going to start 1957 with the first climate change warnings issued by Roger Revelle and Hans Süss. Then 58, we started, or not we, Dave Keeling, the person that brought us the Keeling curve. We're going to look into that in a few slides. Started systematically recording or measuring the atmospheric CO2. And then in the 70s, we had the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, which was more or less the first starting point for this. We had the first World Climate Conference. Then we had the IPCC formation. So the IPCC being this United Nations body that we heavily referenced last time when we talked about the difference between 1.5, 2, 3, and 4 degree global warming. A lot of those examples come from the regularly published IPCC reports. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. Then we had another highlight, the Earth Summit in Rio, the Kyoto Protocol, which is personally for me one of those first political climate things that I recall as a child. So I was born 1990, and 7, probably 8, you start to pick up stuff from the radio. That was something you listened to back then, because we did not have Spotify or other stuff. So the radio was on in the car, so you could like get something like that. Then 12 years later, Copenhagen Accord, and more importantly, probably something where you have your first reference points, maybe from the news, the Paris Agreement, is supposedly something important that happened with respect to politics and climate change. And then the Glasgow Climate Pact, and something that we did not list here is what we're also briefly going to talk about, is the climate conferences in 2022 in Egypt and 2023, I think. Right now, if Anand could maybe briefly check it, I think right now is the current COP in Abu Dhabi. We'll get back to that in a second. Anand will probably figure that out once I'm there. Good. So there is a long history of people talking about saving our environment. So it's not a new concept. It's not something we're talking about just for the last few years. So let's first start with the Keeling curve with Charles David Keeling that I already referenced on the last slide. There is a figure. I don't know why the figure was missing. That's pretty much the graph, the figure that he's most famous for, which is also called, like, named after him, the Keeling curve. And what you can see on the bottom is a time frame starting 1960 or just before 1960s going on till today. And on the y-axis, we have the CO2 fraction in dry air, or you could also just say how much CO2 is in the air in simpler terms. And you usually measure that in parts per million or any other meaningful way. We started with a CO2 fraction in dry air at around 320 micromole per mole, parts per million also being like very famous. And you can see some like minor fluctuations here, but essentially it goes straight up. So already between 1960 and 1980, we had this very strong upwards trend. So we've been aware of the fact that we can measure CO2 in the atmosphere. We started, and we get back to that in a second, started to have theories about, this might not be good. And then we had already in 1980, 20 years of recordings that supported those worries that people had back then. So it's not like just by now we have all this knowledge. We had this knowledge and the understanding and the data for all this stuff already in the 1980s. So he started in 1958, he does it in a observatory on Hawaii, and they continuously measured those devices. And earlier, people were really worried to hit the 400 threshold. Now we're comfortably on our way to 420 or even 450. So what once seemed to be super dangerous threshold, we're already past that. We are excelled at emitting more CO2 to the atmosphere. So there are some seasonal, this is essentially just the point of this small figure up here. There are some seasonal variations of CO2 in the atmosphere. And what you have here is the annual average. So the question being why the most CO2 is in the air in May. I personally would need to look that up, because I'm also like, when I think about this problem now, I would probably map it to our season as a Northern or Middle European person. I don't know whether how we experience our seasonal stuff gives the best intuition for why there is the most CO2 in the atmosphere in May on a global level. So someone is probably writing that down for me right now, that we'll figure out why the highest peak is in May. Maybe we can figure it out for the Q&A session. Otherwise, we'll get back. Because good question, but I just don't know. But we'll try to get back with a useful answer on that. So if we look back on the timeline, so this is 1958, 1972, and 1979 being the next relevant dates here. So 1972 was this first conference where they started to think about like, okay, how can humans maybe do something on this planet for a little bit longer? What kind of impact do we have? Was like a little bit of a starting point, but 1979 was the real first major event on climate change in particular. Happened in Geneva, was initiated by the World Meteorological Organization. So people that look at the atmosphere and the weather, and they're like, huh? Is it relevant? Should we talk about this? And it was not what you expect now when you think about climate change conference. Back then, it was more a scientific gathering. supposed to help like exploring how climate change might affect human activities, because there were some theories or some like thoughts. Okay, is this a problem or not? Is this going to be a problem? And if yes, what type of problem? So people back then really didn't know better in 1979, even though they started to collect data. Back then it was really like an unclear question. It's not like today where we know this is a problem. It led to the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We'll get to that in a second. But this was mostly, or like in essence, the starting point. And even there, 1979, so 44 years ago, they already urged the governments to foresee and prevent potential man-made changes in climate that might be adverse to the well-being of humanity. So even then, we don't understand it completely, but please consider this threat and do something about it by, first of all, understanding the problem in more depth. And then, if it turns out to be a real problem, do something. So 43 years of 9 years later, so it took quite a while to found this IPCC. They founded the IPCC, an intergovernmental body of the United Nations, and its task is to provide policymakers with regular assessments of the scientific basis of climate change, its impacts and future risks, and options for adoption and mitigation. So those IPCC reports are compiled, did I put this on slides? Yeah, by tons of researchers that try to assess, first collect latest research reports, then assess like the different types of qualities, because you might have some new findings here, higher quality than other findings here. Some findings are contradicting each other. Why do they contradict each other? Because different base assumptions and so on. So they're essentially processing the vast amount of new scientific knowledge being produced in a certain amount of time. And then they think, okay, what does that mean? They assess them in reports. If this is true, then we have this scenario. If this is true, then we have this scenario. We also had like a lot of examples for 1.5 with 3 degrees global warming from those reports, and they publish them on a regular basis. So you can go to the IPCC website, which I highly recommend, and get the reports there. There's usually an executive summary, so super short. Then there's a short summary. Then there is a very long and extensive summary, and sometimes like certain parts you can also read separately, or they have a lot of information in nice figures and illustrations on the website. So it's really worth having a look into that, because it's probably one of the most, not compelling, that most like wealthy bodies of knowledge that we have on this topic. We'll also come to some shortcomings in a second, but it's a very good resource to get started, or to also remain in this topic. So the IPCC assessments are supposed to provide a scientific basis for governments to develop climate-related policies. They are policy relevant, but not policy descriptive. Means they may present like projections of future climate change based or different scenarios. They also tell you something about the risks, but they don't tell policymakers what actions to take. They want to remain those scientists who just provide you knowledge, and then you have to do stuff yourself. So essentially just giving you knowledge, and then policymakers are supposed to do something. And those reports are, as already like indicated, are written by hundreds of scientists. You have some lead scientists who volunteer their time and expertise as coordinating lead authors and lead authors of the reports. And they enlist then hundreds of other experts as contributing authors to provide complementary expertise in specific areas. One of the problems with a report that is compiled by hundreds of people is there's some type of disagreement among them. And it also has to go through, it's a United Nations body, so it also has to go through various committees there. And long story short, the IPCC reports sometimes seem to provide a drastic outline or overview or like outcast for the future, but those are quite conservative, because usually you have to find a certain denominator where everyone says, yeah, I'm fine with that. So it's very much like politics. you have maybe the best solution for that, but there's Hans who doesn't want your best solution. Then you have to get to a compromise, and then everyone is fine with this. But this shifts this to a very conservative perspective on what's happening. So even though the IPCC reports sometimes seem a little bit doomsday scenarios, they are still more conservative approaches. So they are not the forefront of world is going south people. They are rather conservative approach here. That's not really being a problem. Maybe that was a wrong phrase, but something to understand when reading IPCC reports and putting them in perspective to other reports that you might have read or heard or whatever. So next, milestones, another 9 years later, that is worth talking about in this very short history is the Kyoto Protocol that I mentioned earlier. And it was after having this first meeting in Geneva, then the IPCC foundation formation, and then the next major milestone was this Kyoto Protocol, where we had a first commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and concentration in the atmosphere to a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So from 1958, where we started recording CO2 in the atmosphere, took us just almost 40 years to start doing something about it. It recognizes that global warming occurs and that human-made greenhouse gas emissions are driving it. And the developed nations back then pledged to reduce overall emissions of such gases by at least 5% below 1919 levels in the commitment period 2008 to 2012. And it entered into force on 16th of February 2005. So even after those pledges, it took us another 8 years to finally start. Okay, we start doing stuff now. But because this is a lecture about buts, even though they finally recognized this after scientists urging them for 20 years plus, there is a but. They recognized it, but USA and Australia, as well as other countries, refused to ratify the agreement. So they're like, hey, yeah, we should do that. But you, not I. We think this is important, but I cannot do this for reasons A, B, and C that are completely made up bullshit. So USA, Australia, and other countries who are among the prime emitters of greenhouse gas emissions backed out of this immediately. Other countries like Canada withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol in 2012. That already gives you a little bit of an idea, okay, of the level of commitment that they had in connection with the bold statement that they made there. And this might be a little bit difficult to read, but let's first check before I start another rant. The public chat. We can back to. Oh, my Jesus, my German, my not good at talking today. This is why it's good that we pre-recorded this video. We can come back to that in the Q&A session. I have, I think, a slide on that hidden somewhere. But very good question. So what are the reasons why they are not ratifying that? Thanks for the question. We'll get back to that. What do we have here? We have a figure that gives you at the bottom the percentage change from 1990, so minus 50 to plus 60 in percent. We have countries listed here, and what is changing over this time period for those countries? The carbon dioxide emissions from fuel combustion and Kyoto Protocol targets. So essentially, you have a white bar that gives you how much, according to Kyoto protocols, wanted a country to reduce their emissions. So where did they want to be according to the Kyoto protocols commitments that they made? And then the black bar is where did they end up? So did they reduce it? Did they increase it? So what happened? So, and we're from Germany, so let's take Germany. And we wanted to reduce it by 21%, and we ended up reducing it by 21.1%. So actually not that bad. What else did we? So this is all compared to 1990 to 2009. Some other countries, like who's also among our prime polluters, Canada. I mean, they backed out. But they wanted to reduce by 6% and ended up increasing by 20%. Who else do we have? United Kingdom also reduced it quite nicely. Spain wanted to get up by 50% and managed to get up by 40%. Who's up there? I think that's Italy. Yeah, Italy wanted to. Yeah, so essentially, long story short, I can come up with a lot of examples now. Australia being not really among the prime candidates here, increasing by 51%. But you can also see a lot of very long black bars going to the left. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Russian Federation, Slovak Republic, Ukraine. Why are they all so good at reducing their greenhouse gas or their carbon dioxide emissions? Because those countries are not really known to be the climate protection forefront of our society. So who knows why? Yeah, the collapse of the Soviet Union caused a massive economics collapse. That caused a lot of the economic productivity going south, and that also reduced their emissions heavily. So it's not, this might give a wrong impression otherwise, so they are not the most handsome and motivated environmental protectors. They are just in an unlucky economic situation back then. So long story short, Kyoto Protocol, first commitment where he said, yep, let's do something. Some actually did something, but most of the big players didn't do much or nothing at all. But it's a start. Next, 12 years later, Copenhagen Accord. There was a lot of, or huge expectations going into the Copenhagen Climate Conference. Obama flew in last minute, if I recall correctly, to try to save the conference and like get something out of this, some kind of commitment, some kind of a good thing. Or was it Biden, the vice president? One of those two like flew in last minute to try to save the world. But in the end, the draft that they had was only drafted by 5 countries. And as you might remember, 193 United Nations countries, so 5 is not really a strong continent. I don't think so, but I would also need to check that very specific question. Writing it down, because I think we're not going to get that for the Q&A session, because then we would need to dive deeper into the actual figure again. I have to look it up, honestly. Good. Drafted by only 5 countries out of 193. What they drafted was not supposed to be legally binding. It also didn't really contain any real targets. They endorsed the continuation of the Kyoto Protocol, and endorse is a really strong legal word. It essentially says, yeah, please, can you? You should. They also had this another phrase here: we emphasize our strong political will to urgently combat climate change in accordance with the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So it's a very nice phrase to back out early by claiming that this is not within your respective capabilities. We shall recognize the scientific view that the increase in global temperature should be below 2 degrees Celsius. 1.5 somehow disappeared here. We also shall only recognize the scientific view. Yeah, long story short, a lot of hopes, because in 2009, like this scientific consensus was already pretty strong that we're running out of time and that we should do something. But this is all we get from the most powerful politicians in the world back then. No real plan. Paris then was another beacon of hope, and once again a lot of expectations went in there. And what they agreed on there is that the greenhouse gas emissions should reach their peak as soon as possible. Something that seems to be quite intuitive. Probably should have reached this peak way before, but okay. They also argued or emphasized or like said that it makes sense to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So pretty much what same they said 6 years before, and what scientists asked them to do for quite a while. Most scientists actually arguing for 1.5, but they couldn't even agree on 1.5. But they could say or agree on pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degree, which then would be below 2 degree. And they wanted to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. So notice, okay, it's a little bit late now. And foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions developments in a manner that does not threaten food production and other stuff. Wait. And they also wanted to make financial flows consistent with the pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, which essentially just say how can we pay or buy ourselves out of this mess now that it's a little bit too late. So how can we make money with that? So some commitments, but once again, nothing like no hard facts listed here. No one says, bam. So another 6 years wasted. Then 2021, we're back. We reaffirm that 2 degrees should be really the upper limit, but 1.5 would be better. Reiterating that so that we do not forget this. They also included accelerating efforts towards the phase out of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Okay, not bad. If you really do that, good point. It urges developed country parties to provide enhanced support, including through financial resources, technology transfer, and capacity building to assist developing countries. Thought this goes without saying. And in the end, this rather rough and not so ambitious thing got approved. So this is the closest we got to some kind of a consensus, because 140 countries out of those 193 roughly pledged to reach net zero emissions, 100 plus countries pledged to reverse deforestation by 2030, and 40 plus countries pledged to move away from coal. Those numbers sound good for now, and I mean honestly it's much further than we ever got before. But obviously then afterwards, like various countries dropped out or said, yeah, we're committed to this, but COVID stopped us from getting further, or we're missing X or Y or Z. Don't have to like tell you now after this rather like pessimistic lecture that we're far away from reaching those goals, but moving in the right direction. So I don't want to shit talk about all of this for a whole 90 minutes. There are like progress being made in the right direction, just not on the scale that we're looking for. I have to look it up, but I think, because I think I was enraged about that, I think they didn't give a timeline for that. I think they could only commit to saying we want to reach net zero, but I think it did not give you a timeline. But don't reference me on this in a public publication now. I would need to look it up to be 100% sure, but I think it was without a time scale, if I'm not mistaken.
If we are all dead, then we did anything.
True. So comment from the audience, if we're all dead, emissions go to net zero anyway, that is true. No, but also like, let's say if we make the timeline 2200, and there is a theoretical, there's enough time to develop technologies. It's essentially non-binding if you say by 2100 is even most non-binding for most of us. I mean, we're quite young. If we make it to 2100, we'll have to see. Like even without all the like challenges that our planet has, just getting 100 years old is like one of those nice things you can say, but no one is like, you're not accountable for that. 2100. So I guess we can figure that out in the Q&A session to get back to you on with a definite date, but I think it was without a timeline. Good. What do we have left? The United Nations Climate Change Conferences 2022 and 2023. They're also, by the way, they're also like the short abbreviation is often COP, so COP. 27 was in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022. No relevant results. The only noticeable interest here was from fossil fuel lobbyists. More than 600 of them registered and attended, and I guess most of them were not really there to receive further education on climate change related topics, but rather to argue in favor of those people who are paying them. Next one was then in Dubai, designated president. Is it really in Dubai, or is it a spelling mistake? Isn't it in Abu Dhabi? It's in Dubai. Okay, good, thank you. So, I mean, Egypt was already quite questionable, given their human rights records and their motivation to be among the green future leaders of this planet. Dubai, I don't know. It starts to getting more questionable, especially if you read that the designated president is Sultan Al Jaber, who is the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And I'm not an expert on Abu Dhabi or Dubai or like these countries, but I can imagine that there might be at least one better suitable person living there or working there than the head of the National Oil Company to lead our planet into a more sustainable future. But maybe I'm wrong because they appointed him and not me, so what do I know? So it's happening right now. Starting tomorrow, okay, so you can still attend if you like. But given the circumstances or like given the past progress made in the past at the climate change conference and the constellation of this event in Dubai with the head being the president of an oil company, I do not expect really a lot of progress on that. But if it happens, we will update this lecture as soon as we can. And then I will apologize in front of all the people that I did wrong. If this is now the climate change conference that saves the planet, I will have no problem recording a new video apologizing in public. Good. That said, I want to make one more strong point, saying even though I highlighted a lot of negative things about political inactions, mostly what we're talking about, of course, something happened, just not on the scale that we would need, especially now that we're running out of time more and more and more. And also if you see like what happened, but in what kind of time frame, like they had since 1958 till now, like when they started recording CO2, but even if you take the first like 1972 and 79 summits, like this has been more lifetime than I'm here on this planet, so like 40, 50 years by now. Given this time frame and how many times scientists urged them to do something, how many times people asked them to do something, still what happened is very minimal. But obviously something happened. That is like, I don't want to question this. And so pushing this further and still demanding gets you somewhere, but it's not enough yet. And that leads us to the second short topic of today that will be a little bit shorter than the previous parts that we had today, and that is activism. Because you can also say, okay, look, we have a problem and I will become part of the political progress and then do my part, not progress of the political process, sorry, and I will do my part and I will make sure that mistakes being made in the past won't happen again. That's a completely valid approach to essentially try to do something from the inside. Other alternative options could go in the direction of more like active participation approach, so not political, but more activism. We have probably all experienced by now different activism groups or forms of activism as well. So Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Last Generation, First Earth movement, First Earth Nation movement, and so on and so on. And they usually have different, or not all of them have different, like some of them have also very much overlapping ways of protesting. And there are like very diverse types of political protest. This is just like a rough overview. I'm not claiming this is complete or not, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what type of activisms we're talking about in the context of sustainability. So all of you probably know the last generation people who like to glue themselves to the street or onto paintings or whatever is just there to glue yourself to. What type of protest form would that be? Come on, is it a strike? Is it a boycott? Is it a petition? Gluing yourself to the street. Which category? Did someone from the online audience save you? Occupation? Other opinions? Maybe sit-in, maybe also like it often involves some sit-in like structures. So yeah. Could also have something like disruptive, sometimes even a lockdown like approach. So the point of that question was not to like legally define what last generation is doing there, but to get you an idea of this okay, even these protest forms that seem to be quite simple and straightforward might not like be easily adapted to all of those like different types of political protest. A lot of those protest forms, especially those that are have been more recently prototyped and are developing now, do not always like perfectly fit those on the first sight. Obviously, I'm not an expert on types of political protest and their school book definitions, but from what you've seen there, I will also agree with your assessments here. Good. A lot of protests can be violent or non-violent. We talked about the 3.5% in non-violent already before. But in general, protests can always be violent or non-violent. Good. So let's make a short dive into some of these forms of activism. Probably among the most commonly known forms of protest and groups in this activism range is probably Fridays for Future, initiated by Greta Thunberg when she started to skip school on Fridays. And instead of going to school, she went out and protested against the inaction of her government with respect to climate change. Over time, more and more people joined in, and it became a global movement that in its prime got millions of people into the street. That doesn't mean that they are now gone. Like, they're still very much active, and I know that there are even like subsidiaries here in Goslar and Clausthal and other places. We actually also had some of them already visiting us. So, or at least like we have been here at the GoTech talking to some of them. So they still exist. They still do stuff. So it's not like they're gone. Something that originated, I'm not sure if everyone agrees with me, or if it's fair to say that Extinction Rebellion originated from Fridays for Futures, but clearly came up in a similar or in close timely proximity to Fridays for Future after a while, is Extinction Rebellion. And while Fridays for Futures has this approach, okay, we skip school on Fridays and protest, Extinction Rebellion goes a little bit further with respect to how much they are willing to push and go. So Extinction Rebellion, previously being very famous for, first of all, their very artful ways of protesting. There have been quite often very entertaining or artistic elements in their forms of protests, but they also had a very strong focus on being disobedient. So sitting on streets together with a lot of people and not leaving when the police asks you to do, but with a very heavy focus on non-violence. So yep, you can carry me away, but I will sit here and take the consequences or bear the consequences of sitting here and not acting against the police, but not cooperating with them, being disobedient, no matter what it costs me. So there was this, you can call it a radicalization or a way of showing stronger commitment by saying, yep, I'm happy to get into trouble with the legal system because I'm so worried about the inaction with respect to climate change and protecting our environment that I just don't see any other way, because you're not doing anything. So what am I supposed to do? I have to be disobedient. I have to, the idea of making a statement and pushing so hard that these 3.5% that you need for a non-violent revolution pick up. Maybe also with the idea in mind that last generation is pushing now very heavily. You cannot put all of us in jail. If, let's say, 3.5 or 4 or 5% of the population is in jail, then society hope, this is like one of the hope, might be unhappy because, let's say, 5% of the population is in jail. Everyone knows someone who is in jail. And then you might get like political change. There are obviously like different theoretical approaches and goals and agendas and strategies behind this. I'm just like very shortly now highlighting the different groups here that are most prominent to get a little bit of an overview, so that when you leave, you know at least like, okay, this is, no, you can have a proper discussion about this. But if you're interested in those, please check them out separately in detail, because I'm not a representative of any of those groups, and I'm also not an expert on all of the group's strategies, goals, insights, and whatever. So yeah, talked about different types of protests here. When you see Fridays for Futures protesting, not going to school, and you see the Extinction Rebellion people very openly talking about disobedience and marketing disobedience as one of their main strategies, of course there is the feedback from various groups in the society might be very negative, or at least not so supportive as you might see. So there have been like very supportive voices that say, yep, I would not join them and sit there on the street and getting handcuffed by the police, but I understand why they do it and I'm in support of this. Others are more like, yeah, do you think this really does something helpful, or is there a better way? And then it's obviously also like on the very other spectrum part, where you compare them more or less to climate terrorists being at the brink of causing violence or disruption of your life. And climate activists are sometimes, or nowadays, often depicted as dangerous radicals. But the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Any idea who said that? It's not Greta. First guess? It's not Greta. It's also none of the founders or any like one associated with those groups. It's the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who's very strongly, at least in this statement, arguing in favor of acceptance of these types of protests, because you could have done something, politicians and governments. They're just doing this because they are not satisfied with where we got so far. There is, as I already said, for Extinction Rebellion, they said, okay, I'm willing to protest this, I'm willing to take personal consequences for that, I'm willing to get in conflict with the law, I'm willing to be disobedient. That usually works quite well with the police or other law enforcement. It sometimes, or now more often, doesn't work very well with people that are affected by the protests form. So I think it was in Panama where a former professor just shot 2 protesters. Also in Germany we had various incidences where kind of physical attacks happened to people. This is a video link that we cannot show you here for copyright reasons, from a protest, I think it was in Göttingen, from one of the Extinction Rebellion people there, who got hit in the face, and the next for protesting, and the next thing he did was just sitting back down on the street and continuing his protest. So that people are like, some people are so worried about this and so willing to commit to do something that even getting hit in the face is fine, and they just continue doing so. And this is a very good illustration of the desperation that a lot of people in those active communities have, and that are often not very well communicated. If you look at some media reports, there's often about, oh yeah, those people, they are gluing themselves to the street again, or they are protesting again, and this becomes quite annoying. What do you get from gluing yourself to the street? It doesn't really change anything. It's very often the line of reasoning that you have. But the other question is, what else to do? Is there like any other way of protest that keeps the discussion going? And this, I'm not asking this rhetorically, and this is like an active discussion in a lot of those active communities. Like, sure, this is super annoying, and we didn't achieve our goals yet, so it's obviously not the best ways of protest. What else could we test? Like, what else could we do? Then they started throwing stuff at the glass ceilings from paintings, or painting the Brandenburger Tor, or whatever. So like, people are experimenting with things. But what else could we do? Because they are so desperate, they don't see another way of expressing their problems and their anger and the request to do something. So what else to do? Just sit there at home and not do anything. And this growing frustration is also one of the reasons why we can see a certain trajectory from Fridays for Futures just skipping school, which was seen as a super radical step back then. You cannot skip school on Fridays. And then to Extinction Rebellion say, yeah, I'm happy to get in conflict with the law. I want to be disobedient. Yeah, fine me or take me to prison. And then to the essentially next iteration that we have in Germany, Letzte Generation, or Last Generation, who is pushing that one step further. So as is Henning Jeschke, one of the founders of the Letzte Generation of Last Generation, they became quite popular during the election in Germany in 2021, where they asked for a discussion, a meeting with the candidates for chancellor, and they were not really interested in talking to them. And so they went on a hunger strike for 27 days. The picture is number 25, where Henning is losing some weight. And afterwards, some of them ended up in an intensive care unit. He wasn't the only one going on the hunger strike. There were like various people with him. Some of them lasted as long as he, others not. But this is not the point of who can do the longest. But they finally at least got, after this commitment, they got their appointment with, at that point, Olaf Scholz, who was then, okay, yeah, we know it's going to be Scholz. And they had a podium discussion, kind of style of thing. You can watch the video. Quite depressing, to be honest, but watch it yourself if you form your own opinion. But at least there wasn't really any feedback from Olaf Scholz. But looking at this trajectory of radicalization and willingness, the level of willingness to commit to ask for a future worth living, from I skip for just like, hey, I go to demonstration because I'm mad, to skip school, to yep, willing to go to jail, willing to go to the ICU, and from all the other ways of last generation protests that you might be aware of, from gluing themselves. I already discussed them. There are also like various lawsuits pending against them. I think it's Bavaria who's trying to charge them as a criminal organization, and so on and so on. So there is like a lot of legal trouble going on for them, but still they are like, yep, but what else to do? Nothing else to do here. So essentially giving you this intuition of the desperation of people, because usually it's just, yeah, they're annoying and they don't reach something, but without like a lot of constructive feedback behind that. But even though those people are so desperate that they don't see any help from the government or politicians right now, there are still also legal ways of getting or pushing this your right for a future worth living. There's one example from one of the Fridays for Future members here in Germany, Luisa Neubauer, who was involved in a lawsuit against the German government. 9 young people from Germany sued Germany, and they argue that the goals and measures of the Federal Climate Protection Act are not sufficient to effectively protect their fundamental rights from the consequences of the climate crisis, as well as to fulfill the government's obligation under the Paris Agreement. So they essentially took the Paris Agreement and what they're doing right now and said, look, you're not, what you're doing here doesn't get you to the Paris Agreement that you agreed to, and also I have a right for a future worth living, so do something. And they won in court. Freedoms and fundamental rights are already being violated today by insufficient climate protection. The legislators must adapt the Federal Climate Protection Act by the end of 22. They did that. If this is not enough, is up for discussion, but at least there is a case for you also saying, look, I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to go to the ICU. I don't want to skip Wednesday classes here because I like the limits to growth so much. But so there is also a different way of protesting. You can go into politics. You can become an activist. You can go the legal way. We'll talk about other ways what you can do. Just like highlighting that there is like people need to do something. 9 people said, look, let's sue the German government. Sounds pretty unreasonable and not high probability of winning. But they did, and they did something to move it in the right direction. Of course, this is once again what I said before about the political inaction. It feels like not much or nothing at all, especially given the time span. But at least they're moving it in the right direction. So Luisa also made a statement there. You can read that yourself. I don't have to read it out loud. But long story short, 9 people did that. They sued. They won. And that leads us to the conclusion of today. This was, of course, not a complete overview on all forms of activisms and relevant groups. It's also not something that just happened with Fridays for Future. There have been environmental movements way before that. This is just the most recent and very popular formations of groups outside the normal political spectrums, like the Green Party or whatever, that occurred in recent time, and also this trajectory of a certain radicalization. So what did we talk about today? First, Sustainable Development Goals, even though this might already feel very distant because it's been 1.5 hours by now. We also had a look at the short history of actions on climate change from the first recordings of the Keeling curves in 1958, or what then became the Keeling curve. Geneva, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris, Glasgow, Dubai, and the problems or the insufficient results coming from those climate conferences. And then we also looked a little bit at more individual levels of activism as a response or counter movement to the feeling of inactive governments who ignore urgent issues, like our 3 key challenges that we had. So before I move to the exercise, we'll keep that for the Q&A, what the changes are that have been made for the Federal Protection Act. But before that, first, your next exercise that is already online. And as I already said, part of your first exercise is going to be that you watch the first MOOC content, because I promised you more things that you can do right now. And there are, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2 videos that we produced about more general sustainability practices, or modules about sustainability practices, and 1 hands-on in-depth drive for something that you can also do right away with respect to food sharing and getting free food. So as students, that's probably a very wild motivation. So enjoy watching those 2 exercises. So that's the first task, listed under 1. And then the second one is more a task for you to write something. So we discussed the history of international and national actions, and you learned something in part 1 here. And then 2 subtasks for you. What is more important when it comes to fighting climate change and the other challenge that we discussed? First, political action. Second, collective action. Or third, individual action. And then please explain why. Reminder, if you don't want to do the homework, you don't have to do it. So please don't send us ChatGPT answers. We don't want to read those. We are interested in your honest, wholehearted feedback on this. Because first of all, it also helps us to develop the content here and to have a discussion and to get insights, because I don't claim that I have the solution for all the stuff we do, neither does Anand nor Teresa, so we're really also interested in your thoughts on how to push stuff forward. The first part, super simple and quite joyful. The second part, slightly something where you have to think about maybe a little bit, especially when it comes to why. And then please submit everything via the usual exercise submission link that Teresa provided. And if there are any questions, you can drop us an email. And that's it for today. Now we'll take, let's say, a 10-minute break. Or since we have to look up some questions, we'll start at 3 p.m. because I think Teresa and Anand probably already prepared some answers for me, but some others we might have to look up again. So 3 p.m. it is. Enjoy your break. We'll be back for the Q&A in the same room and stop the recording now. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much for the active participation.